in that scene in Nazareth, there is no disconnect. I see everybody freaking out, and I'm watching it, and I'm seeing why they're freaking out, you know? And then Jesus is saying, I am the law of Moses, and I'm like, oh man, this is epic, you know? But so there's no disconnect there, you know?
Yeah.
You're selling it to me, and I'm buying it. But in the case of the Sermon on the Mount, you know, because they don't really flesh it out, because they do really deliver it sort of, you know, in this bullet point fashion, it kind of doesn't rise to more than that kind of a summary. And so, Brother Josh, like you were saying, they do a very good job of taking these intimate moments and making them quite epic and profound. But then these sort of larger set pieces where everything about the way that the characters are responding and what the writing is telling me is saying, this is epic. Well, I can see it. And guys, I'm sorry, it's not that epic.
This is Criteria.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras, here with my co-host James Majewski. Hello.
Hello, Thomas.
And we're here with our returning guest, Brother Joshua Vargas, who is a seminarian and a brother in the Philadelphia Oratory. Welcome back, Brother Josh.
Hello, thank you. Glad to be back.
You might guess, listeners, since Brother Josh is with us again, that we are once again discussing a new season of The Chosen. 3 seasons in, right? So the show has kind of established its groove by this point. We kind of have a good idea of what this show is. Its strengths, weaknesses, are pretty consistent at this point, I'd say. Last time, and to an extent in the first season discussion, we talked about some scenes that people might find doctrinally problematic and just tried to figure out whether they're actually, doctrinally heretical or just problematic or just ambiguous or artistic license or whatever, all the different shades. I think in this season, there's fewer things that are overtly doctrinally problematic than there were in the second season.
Definitely.
I wish I could say the same for the Christmas special that came out, well, now 2 Christmases ago, because it's been a little while since season 2, which was called The Messengers. It was one of their big theatrical events. And
I never saw that.
Yeah. So you guys never saw it. So I'm only bringing it up. I feel like it's important to touch on it because it was rather doctrinally problematic, more so than anything else that I've seen from the series. And I'm grateful that it was in this Christmas special, which is sort of like a side thing.
It's not canonical.
Yeah, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But
I'm just being
but they've had 2 Christmas specials. The pilot, or the like sort of little test thing that they did before the show started, was also a Christmas episode. I've never watched that, probably never will. But this latest one was The Messengers, and it's sort of a nativity story. But there's also a flashback with Mary and Joseph coming to Bethlehem for the birth of Christ. And not to get into the details, but basically there's a point at which Mary makes a big thing of apologizing to Joseph for not being sufficiently grateful for everything that he's done for her.
I think I remember you mentioning this at the time.
I don't know whether the filmmakers intended this to be like, see, Mary can sin, but I think a failure of gratitude, any failure of gratitude that you have to really apologize for, is probably a sin. And also, Mary, she is someone who is perfectly cooperating with the whole inspiration of the Holy Spirit. She's doesn't have concupiscence, so she'd be perfectly recollected, I would think. And so she wouldn't fail in gratitude. Even she wouldn't even be as sort of absent-mindedly forgetful in an innocent way as we sometimes are, where we forget to thank someone for something until later, and it's not necessarily a sin. So anyway, that's the most, I think, explicitly doctrinally erroneous thing that the show has done. So it's not necessary to follow the plot of the show to even see that Christmas special. So I just tell people to not even bother with it because it's okay otherwise, but it's not amazing. But season 3, a lot of things that I liked about season 3.
Yeah.
And I think I'm also getting confident enough in some of my aesthetic criticisms that maybe I'll go a little further in some of those than I have in the past seasons as well.
Cool.
But yeah, so I'd like to get your impressions, guys, on overall big picture what you thought of this season. Brother Josh, how about you?
Well, there were, as always, some really powerful moments in this season that moved me very much. I can say I've moved to tears a couple times at least. And really, really beautiful performances as well. They did a wonderful job, as always, of capturing the emotions of people receiving healing, receiving liberation. I think, however, I was a little overwhelmed by how many different sort of plot points they had running simultaneously through the whole season. I think they maybe tried to bite off a little bit too much all at once. I tried actually enumerating all of them. And I realized when I was going back and watching the season a second time, why I was having trouble keeping track of them, because there were so many things that kind of spanned multiple episodes happening with different characters, including some relatively minor characters. So I thought that was a little bit of a weakness there, or maybe a significant weakness, really. And as always, there's the candles. There were lots and lots and lots of candles.
Yeah, can you remind our viewers? You said this in our first Chosen discussion, but what's the problem with the candles?
They would not have been using candles widely in the first century. Candles have been around for a long time. They were there in ancient Egypt. Candles were made primarily with beef tallow. And so Romans had been making candles. You made them by dipping. They were these kind of skinny things that looked like a root vegetable, sort of. They were not like these pillar candles that they have all over the place. Typically, people would have lit their houses with oil lamps. And in fact, there are early rabbinic rulings specifying that you cannot make lights with animal fat or with wax or with anything else. It has to be oil.
Interesting.
So it's like, that's pretty, I don't know, there's a lot of candles everywhere. And some of them look like something you'd pick up at Kmart too. So it's a little distracting to me.
This show has really hit its stride. It's kind of become what it is. And so I think that a lot of my feelings about the show have also cemented, So whereas maybe in the first and second season, there was a little more space to be, a little more questioning about what direction this show might take, or if a particular criticism was sort of like a one-off thing or not. Now I think that the tone of the show is very clear. The writing style is very clear. A lot of the, performances are very clear. I will say, again, echoing what you said, Brother Josh, I was moved very profoundly several times in this season. So not just like once or twice, but there were several moments, and a couple of which I definitely was moved to tears, which is not a common occurrence for me.
I think almost every episode had at least like one really, really good scene.
Yeah, and so this show is pretty remarkable because when it gets it right, ooh, man, does it get it right. And one thing I'll just say right off the bat is that Jonathan Roumie continues to just be a phenomenon, like this show.
Playing Jesus.
Yes. This show has a lot of good things going for it. None of them come close to the good thing that is Jonathan Roumie playing Jesus. I just have not enough good things to say about his performance in this role. I think that that the writing serves Jesus perhaps a little more than in some of the other characters, but I also think that what Jonathan Roumie is doing with the writing is a lot more than perhaps what some of the other performances are doing too. So I don't think you get this show without a really strong person playing Jesus. And what I found for me as a viewer was that I was just like waiting for that next moment that I was going to be with Jesus and listening to him. And I think it was the third episode that takes us to Nazareth. Is it the third episode?
Yes, I think so.
When Jesus returns home to Nazareth.
Yes.
And we basically get the whole episode with him. That was just a treat, you know. I really just, you know, found that for me, my experience of this season was just sort of like waiting for that next moment that I was going to be with Jesus, which, hey, is not a bad thing.
I didn't think the season got off to a super strong start, but I thought that starting in episode 2, it improved markedly.
Yeah.
I mean, like, so the first episode is really just kind of like, what do you call it, like denouement for the Sermon on the Mount, which was the beginning of which was the very end of season 2. And so you see that the aftermath of the Sermon on the Mount and the disciples sort of like in various ways trying to apply things that they've heard Jesus say. For example, Andrew overcoming some of his anxiety because Jesus says, you know, do not worry about what you are to eat, you know, what you are to wear, etc. And particularly his anxiety about John the Baptist, who remains in prison through this season. And then Matthew, Jesus says the thing about when you go to make a sacrifice, if someone has a grievance against you, make peace with them before presenting your gift at the altar. And we see an important scene with Matthew reconciling with his parents because his storyline was, I don't know if it was bigger in season 1 or season 2, but he was one of the major subplots. He's clearly one of the apostles that they've chosen to focus on the most, alongside like Peter and some others. But, you know, a lot of the drama in the first episode and some of the weaker moments of the season in general, I don't know what it is, but I have trouble with like drama that's based on like bickering.
Yes.
Like vaguely motivated emotional bickering based on like vibes.
Yeah.
And so when I was rewatching parts of these episodes, I found myself, I'd say, skipping over some of the scenes of tension between Mary Magdalene and Tamar. Is that her name?
Mm-hmm.
The Ethiopian woman.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's not based on the way that people really act. Because the upshot of that multi-episode tension, when it resolves, is that Tamar is this very confident disciple of Christ and just sort of comes in guns blazing, and Mary Magdalene definitely has like the identity of like a penitent, almost like a permanent penitent, you know, and is very like humble and reserved. And she sort of like gets annoyed with Tamar about that. And those are real interpersonal dynamics that exist. I don't know what it is that I just don't find compelling about it. What do you think?
I was a little more aggravated by Simon's whole thing. It did drag for me, like how long that kind of went on. And he didn't talk about it to anyone. And he's just kind of going off doing his own thing. And it seemed a little... Not that people don't have moments where they do things that are, let's say, out of character, but it did seem out of character for him.
Yeah. He starts the season very confident.
Yes.
Like a very confident disciple of Jesus and a leader among the apostles. As the season goes on, he just deteriorates from there. And the reason for that, this is kind of the major... It's kind of the major fictional subplot of the season, is that Peter and his wife Eden have this tragedy related to their marriage, and they're not really talking to each other about it, and they're growing apart. And also Peter, when he sort of finds out what's going on, gets very angry at Jesus for allowing him this to happen. And he sort of displays this like sort of avoidant behavior. He just sort of stops hanging out with the rest of the apostles. He goes off wandering around on his own in a funk. And it's not that he loses his faith exactly. It's his faith needs to grow deeper. But it is interesting because he's got, it's like he's got, especially in the last episode, he's got almost this angry faith, this like angry, defiant faith. And the climax of the season is, well, the last episode is the feeding of the 5,000 or is it the 3,000? There's 2 feedings, right?
Yes, I think this was the 5,000.
Okay, so the feeding of the 5,000, and then right after that, like doubled up with another big moment where Jesus walks on the water and Peter goes and walks towards Jesus on the water. And in that scene in particular, it's interesting because Peter is kind of like, what does he say? Like, if you are who you say you are, then bid me to walk out on the water.
Yeah.
And he's like angry, but he's also like confident in Jesus's power.
Yeah.
And it's almost like he's, with every act of faith, he's like proving, it almost feels like he's proving what he fears and suspects, that Jesus is using his power to do for others what he hasn't done for Peter in this personal tragedy.
Yeah.
Like he's upset about that. And so he's almost like putting salt in his own wounds by every like additional like over the top act of faith in the power of Christ.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
I loved this climactic finish to the season. I loved this sort of, you know, completion of the arc that had been really, you know, set through the whole third season.
Right.
You know, because at times, certainly in the midst of these sort of marital, you know, troubles between Peter and Eden, like I definitely, you know, was checking out a little bit. Like you were saying about the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Tamar, but also things with like Rama or Thomas or Zebedee, or there's a scene between Mary Magdalene and Matthew where she's like, you know, seen something of his that she wasn't supposed to have seen in his home, or a lot of kind of like almost like trivial.
Okay, we talked about this with Rings of Power, where there's like the whole thing where Durin gets upset with Elrond because he hasn't come to visit him for 20 years or something.
Yes.
And it's like, it's not like these aren't real things that people get upset about. I don't know what it is, because there's a way to do small drama, comedy of manners, drama of manners, little human, you know, emotional conflicts that's interesting in a movie or a play or novel. Something about it, maybe it's the incongruity between like, I was going to say the incongruity between like the lofty subject matter of like the Gospels and those moments, but I don't even want to say that, because like the stakes of the Gospel and the Christian life should be like as evident and fascinating in those small moments as it is in the big biblical moments. But I don't know, it's hard to put my finger on why I often, in not only in this show, but in a lot of sort of pop TV or movies, these are things that for some reason I tend to tune out.
Yeah. I wonder what it is too. You know, I can only describe what my experience is watching this, and it's an experience of feeling like, okay, this is petty. This is something that could be easily resolved, you know. Right. Like take for instance
you can have a character being petty, then it's interesting.
Right.
That's the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's hard to identify. What I was getting at was that the fact that all of that build up through the season was not for nothing,
right?
But kind of comes with this really awesome punctuation point of not just Peter's walking on the water, but there's this parallel of Eden's going into this cleansing in the temple. So she's being submerged in the water even as Peter is falling into the water and being pulled up by Jesus. Mm-hmm. It's this awesome doubling and a really emotional moment. Yeah. And I thought super effective. It is like a gloss on that scene in the gospel. You know, it's kind of an odd thing for Peter to say, if it is you, bid me to walk out toward you on the water, you know? And one of the things that this show does so well is taking those moments and then sort of concretizing them and making them very, you know, fleshing them out and really introducing some, you know, specific human motivations. I loved that this was coming from a place of like simultaneous defiance, but also, you know, heroic hope and faith, you know, that it's this very complex moment of testing the Lord, but not because you doubt who he is, but almost as if to test your own faith, and in so doing, it's very Job-like, you know.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I thought that that all of that was just, you know, very layered and nuanced and very exciting and very you know, emotionally resonating. And it made me think about how this is not the first time we've seen this on this podcast. This moment of Jesus walking on the water. When we watched that silent film, The Life of Christ, or
Life and Passion of Christ.
Yeah, yeah. And I was thinking about just how far cinema has come, you know, because that was cool too, seeing those sort of primitive techniques that were employed to you know, represent Jesus walking on the water. But here too, I thought that some of the best effects were some of the most practical.
Yeah.
Like, I loved this shot from below through, you know, some glass or whatever of Jesus's feet on the water.
Yeah.
You know, and
the way they did his silhouette when the disciples first see him, that was very effective. Like real less is more kind of.
Yeah. In fact, throughout that scene, he's mostly obscured. Right. You know, it's not super well lit. You see Peter a lot more clearly than you see Jesus. I loved everything about that scene.
Any more thoughts on that, Josh?
I had a pretty different reaction to this scene.
Oh no! Lay it on us.
I know. Sorry. Visually, I loved it, especially what you were saying, how they kind of obscured him for a good chunk of it. Typically, I'm a big fan of how the show takes details in the gospel and embellishes them and kind of gives them backstories that make them even more resonant. In this case, I found Peter's anger over this entirely fictionalized issue. I mean, it's a realistic sort of thing, but, you know, obviously fabricated. I found it a big distraction from both the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, because like the whole time, I think the emotional focus is largely on Peter's unhappiness with what's happening. And because of that, I couldn't really take joy in the miracle. And in fact, I felt a little similarly about this to how I did about the Sermon on the Mount as we saw it at the end of season 2. I feel like the show excels much better at making intimate scenes feel epic than at making large scenes feel epic.
Yes.
And because a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, it was fine. There was nothing bad about it, but it didn't have the weight that some of the other really powerful scenes in the show have. And I thought Peter's whole thing kind of stripped it away more. And I don't begrudge their inclusion of Peter kind of having that argument with Christ and lashing out and whatever. I'm sure that, I think artistically that works within the story they were creating. But having that occur during the storm scene, to me, removed a lot of the immediacy and the punch of that scene, because rather than focusing on the miraculous that's happening and like the the mystery and all of that, I'm focusing on Peter's angry and he's screaming and saying these things. But
we're getting here. I'm glad you mentioned this, Josh, because we're getting into some really big picture artistic issues about adaptation of the Gospels, especially in like a long form TV series, because backstory is a big part of like modern pop culture storytelling. Like there's a lot of reliance on backstory, and particularly in the Gospels, where like there's a reason that these things are like sometimes told in like a very isolated or like not fragmentary, but like gnomic manner, and maybe is part of what you're getting at, that like the more it's personalized about Peter, of course it is about Peter. He's the one who's stepping out in faith. He's the leader in faith, right? But like the more it's personalized about his like personal emotional life and stuff, does it become like less applicable, like less universalizable in terms of our application of this story to our lives in some way?
Maybe. I think there's just the issue that was being tackled, while I was happy actually to see that brought into the show. I think it's an issue that is very common, and a lot of people have a great difficulty dealing with the reality of miscarriage and personal tragedies of that sort. So I was actually happy to see that in the show, but I think having that kind of dominate those two moments of those great miracles in that way was just distracting from the miracles themselves, and also, to my mind, untrue to the sense of Peter's that moment where Peter says in Matthew's gospel, bid me come to you on the wall. Like that to me is one of Peter's characteristic moments of hyper enthusiasm, where everyone else is kind of still thinking about what's happening. Peter is, the first one who wants to jump out of the boat onto the water. So kind of changing that into a moment where Peter is just, like really wrathful and, has, it's an interesting dramatic choice, but to me, it conflicts with the sense of it that we get in the gospel, and also just sapped a lot of the dramatic tension from the scene for me, because it just happens for so long. There's a lot of talking. I think that was one of my biggest issues. There's so much dialogue that's happening in the middle of this loud storm.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
They usually expand the dialogue of any healing scene, any miracle scene, significantly.
Yeah, and I will say that in some places where this text is expanded, I really appreciate it. The scene in Nazareth, for instance, where Jesus is interpreting the scripture, that's really expanded and fleshed out, and I thought that was awesome. That was probably a high point of the season for me. But then it's odd when in other places they don't do that. Notably, the Sermon on the Mount, and then the preaching at the Decapolis. A lot of that is just sort of quotes taken out of the gospel and left at that. And then here, where the exchange between Jesus and Peter in the gospel is actually quite terse, quite short. There's like a whole back and forth, and I'm with you on that, Brother Josh. That it felt a little overmuch, and that maybe there was a eloquence to this brevity, between the two of them.
When you do a season's worth of backstory for a brief moment in the gospel, it's hard, a fictional backstory, it's hard to avoid making that moment more about your backstory, rather than using the backstory to enhance that moment, which I think they would say is their intent. It's more powerful. You can connect to it more because you see all these things going into it.
Yeah, but I think that they could have trusted the work that they had done, everything that they had already preceded this moment with,
without needing to have the whole dialogue.
Exactly. Okay. It would have all lived there. It would have been there in the subtext, and yet you could have let the sort of weight of these words just breathe on their own, and the weight of the moment. I will say that in general, I do think that this is a shortcoming of the writing. I think that in general, there's an awful lot of telling things, a lot of showing things, a lot of spelling things out. And perhaps this is hitting on why we have an issue with some of these pettier moments, because it's true, like you said, Thomas, that petty can be characterized on screen and be interesting, but not if I'm being told by everything else in the staging that this is not petty, that this is actually very important. So like in the Lord of the Rings example, right? We weren't being told that Durin is being really petty and that this is the argument that like schoolboys have. We were being told like, oh, this is like, two like really good friends who one of them really wronged the other, and like these are dramatic stakes, and so the dissonance there is what causes me to check out. Like, dude, okay, this is not important. All right, when everything about how the writing is done, to the performances, to the cinematic emphasis, is telling me that this is actually a moment of like emotional weight or depth, but I can see through it as being really kind of trite, then that's a problem. And I think that that this is also part of why I struggle at, well, I guess I haven't said this yet on the show, but these larger, more epic moments, Brother Josh, like you were saying, they do a very good job of taking these intimate moments and making them quite epic and profound. But then these sort of larger set pieces where everything about the way that the characters are responding and what the writing is telling me is saying, this is epic. Well, I can see it. And guys, I'm sorry, it's not that epic. Actors are really good at selling things. That's like what their job is. So if you're a director and you tell them, like, guys, you're going to hear this sermon and it's going to be life-changing and you're going to just be riveted and just like, it's the most amazing thing you've ever heard in your life. But then when I'm watching it, it's kind of coming across like a, like SparkNotes version of a sermon. Like, okay, I'm not really, there's like a disconnect here between what you're selling me as an actor and what I'm receiving as an audience member.
Yeah.
Now, far be it from me to say that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount was not riveting, but I believe that what we have in the Gospels is probably a summary, a condensed version, the bullet points, like the highlights, like the big things, and that probably, like what was shown us of Jesus' interpretation of the scripture in Nazareth, probably it was fleshed out a little more rhetorically. And there was a lot more, rhetorical flourish or oomph to what was being said. In that scene in Nazareth, there is no disconnect. I see everybody freaking out, and I'm watching it, and I'm seeing why they're freaking out, And then Jesus is saying, I am the law of Moses. And I'm like, oh, man, this is epic, But so there's no disconnect there, Yeah. You're selling it to me and I'm buying it. Mm-hmm. But in the case of the Sermon on the Mount, because they don't really flesh it out, because they do really deliver it sort of, in this bullet point fashion, it kind of doesn't rise to more than that kind of a summary. And so when everybody's walking around kind of wide-eyed and saying this sermon is going to go down in history, well, I'm kind of just like taking your word for that, like you're telling me that that's the response that you're having, and okay, but I'm not really there with you. And I think that maybe perhaps a retort is, oh well, James, you're just you're taking this for granted. You grew up with this. You've heard these words your whole life. They're not as revolutionary for you now as they would have been for people back then. And I would say, well, yes, that very well may be the case. But isn't that part of the reason why we do adaptations like this, to re-access that kind of freshness, that firstness, that newness? And isn't that your job as a writer or as a performer? And
funnily enough, they did handle the Sermon on the Mount similarly to the way they handled Jesus preaching in Pasolini's Gospel according to Matthew.
Totally.
Where they just like cut, it's like all these jump cuts of him just saying different excerpts from the sermon, just on his face.
And then the preaching at the Decapolis is handled similarly. And again, it's hard for me to buy into the emotional stakes of that, because a lot of it is just told me, like, okay, this is how you're supposed to relate to these different groups of people. These are their positions. Look, they have different costumes, and I just have to kind of take your word for it. Okay, yeah, I guess that they're having a big fight, but I'm not really like emotionally bought into this. And so when Jesus is resolving this somehow with his preaching, like, okay, I guess I'm just taking your word for it that this is working. But I'm not really seeing why that's necessarily the case.
Brother Josh, I wanted to ask specifically about that bit. So the idea is that Jesus has sent everybody out, and Andrew and Philip, right, have been sent to the Decapolis. They go, they preach. Some of it isn't received how they think it will be, specifically because they were preaching to the Jews, but some Gentiles heard it, and political, inter-religious, inter-ethnic tensions in their region are being stirred up. by the different people's interpretation of the parables that they're saying, etc. And so Jesus finally comes at the end of the season with them to resolve these problems, and we've got these different factions, like the super observant Jews, some sort of less observant Jews, the
Hellenistic Jews.
the Hellenistic Jews. What's the one? The lady? What's she? The Nabateans. So the Nabateans are apparently the ones. They're apparently these Arabic peoples, and they're the ones who lived in Petra. That's like their ancient city. So they're there, and then some other pagans and stuff, and they're all there. And okay, so Josh, how much of this is like completely made up by the show? How much of this is based on like previous like scholarly speculations about what was going on in the Decapolis, like this whole idea of these different factions coming together, and maybe even that being part of the reason why all these people are there hearing Jesus talk? How much of that is completely made up by the show?
The whole episode of there being tensions caused by the apostles at the Decapolis that then have to be dealt with is made up. The Decapolis, I believe, is mentioned 3 times in the Gospels. I want to say it's twice in Matthew and once in Mark. And I think the earliest kind of chronological story-wise mention of it is actually after the freeing of the Gerasene demoniac, when Jesus cast the demons out of him, legion, into the swine. And then Jesus tells him, go to and preach to your family, about what has been done for you. And instead of just going to his family, he goes to the whole Decapolis and starts, telling everyone. So it seems like he's the one, at least in Mark's gospel, that breaks the news to the Decapolis of who Jesus is and what he's doing. So it doesn't seem like the 12 would have been the first to bring that there. Now, it was a heavily Gentile area. It did have that reputation, and it was a place of kind of intermingling. In terms of Hellenized Jews, that was kind of a matter of degree. Everyone was Hellenized to some degree by this point. But there were various movements rejecting certain degrees of Hellenization that were seen to be too far. And that really kind of starts back with the Maccabean revolt. That's when you get this first kind of strong push against Hellenization. So to kind of just put it into camps where you have Hellenized Jews and then non-Hellenized Jews is a little artificial. But you kind of get what they're trying to do.
And the idea that this had anything to do with the idea of people being kicked out of their villages and stuff because of strife, and that leading to all these people coming to hear Jesus preach, that's all made up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It does feel like that sometimes the show is trying to like put in. We see this sometimes with like the Pharisee storylines as well, like the different factions of. I mean, that's useful, but sometimes it feels like a little like obvious that they're just sort of sticking this in for like historical context about the different factions in the Pharisees and the strict and the lax and all that. I wanted to comment a little bit more on my impression of the feeding itself, the feeding of the 5,000, because this does speak to the topic of how the show handles its big epic moments. I've never been a huge fan of the music on the show. There's some cues that I like. I particularly like the cue that happens when Jesus is being led out of the synagogue for them to cast him off of the cliff. Yeah. It sounded particularly kind of like Middle Eastern and but like there is like kind of a strange thing that they do, which is that like whenever there's a big like mid-season climax or end of season climax, that's when they bring out like the big bluesy rock riffs, and because the rest of the music really isn't doing that, and there's subtle hints of like I guess like gospel singing and that one woman who sings on the soundtrack, but in this particular instance of the feeding of the 5,000, it's like it's almost the music. It's like party music. It's like sorry, my glasses and for the listeners who can't see this, my glasses and my headphones just came off while I was banging my head.
I'm sorry you all missed that.
So I need to get these. I need to get my glasses tightened because they come off easily these days. Anyway, So the thing is that, like, I was just thinking about how this moment would have been handled in, like, a 1950, like, Hollywood biblical epic. The music would have been much much different in that feeding. It would have been like, this is a majestic moment, and it probably would have been like hokey in its own way to some extent, but like it would have been, what might have maybe gotten across a little more of like the spiritual nourishment that people were taking from the feeding of the 5,000, or like even that it's like a proto-Eucharistic moment, which is like totally lost here. The only like sort of more sober depiction of the feeding of the 5,000 we get is afterwards, when Peter's wife Eden goes to see a Rabbi Yusuf, and he's giving her this psalm to pray, and then we see this montage of going back to the feeding. But then it's more focused even on Peter being upset with what's going on. And so I think in both cases, these sort of like the look, I'm sure that when the 5,000 were fed, people were like losing their mind, and I'm sure even the apostles were like probably tempted to see this on just like a carnal level, like, whoa, this is so amazing, like as a spectacle, as a wonder, signs and wonders, but I do think that like the spiritual impact of not of the sermon, but of like the feeding itself is somewhat like lost on screen with that music,
I mean, I had three main issues with the scene. Again, Simon being distracting with his like petulance. The rock music felt tonally strange, and there was a line that Jesus gives at a certain point where he says, I've been giving you all this spiritual food, but you also need real food. And I feel like phrasing it that way is something Jesus would never have done, because he stresses the opposite to his disciples in the gospel. I have food that that my Father gives me, which is to do His will, etc. So it's strange to have him say it that way. His point is understandable, but different words I think would have been better there.
I will say one thing I really liked about that episode is the whole like use of the Psalms, and the way that the Eden plot really like reflects the wisdom of like Jewish purification and mourning practices, and particularly the usefulness of all of the Psalms, even the like desolate and angry Psalms. And I really liked that scene with Rabbi Yusuf, and also the bookends of showing it's Psalm 77, and they're showing its composition and being presented first to King David. It's a psalm of Asaph, so we get like Asaph and his choir presenting this psalm to David and the Queen, and then we get that at the end as well. And I thought that was really great.
Yeah, very cool.
I loved that whole bit, and I loved how what that did with the whole conflict. I mean, I'm not a fan of how the conflict with Peter or Simon and Jesus and Eden was handled. Generally, I felt like it got too much time, and took energy and attention away from other things they were doing too often. But I loved what they did with Eden going to the rabbi and how that played into the whole issue. I thought that was one of the best handled parts of the whole kind of Simon Eden miscarriage saga.
Totally. Right. And it strikes such a different note than the way some of the other problems that some of the other characters have. Some of the ways those problems are handled. So in a lot of instances, what we get is almost this sense of like enmeshed boundaries, where like people are kind of like getting into each other's business and like like overstepping, or like just like creating these kind of like weird, kind of awkward confrontations.
And that's how you get backstory. You get more backstory, right? Because it's when Tamar and Mary Magdalene, I don't know why I keep wanting to call her Veronica, when they clash, that's when we get Tamar's backstory gets squeezed out of her like some tasty lime juice out of a lime, and then and then Matthew and Mary Magdalene again, just getting into people's business.
I know.
And Matthew's backstory gets squeezed out. I mean, I did kind of like that like flashback with Matthew. I just liked like the old guy they had and playing.
Sure. Fine. What's not to like? But like, it's this weird kind of or like Zebedee and the others like showing up and talking to Eden, what's going on with you and Simon, like there's just this kind of I just appreciated that in Eden's case, she took her problems to the rabbi, and she got some wisdom from the Torah, and then she like availed herself of ritual,
Right.
and this for me as a Catholic strikes a lot closer to like my experience of Christian life,
Yes.
and this other thing, I don't want to be too quick to point the finger at the Protestants, and God love you, any Protestants listening to this show. I know that you're there, and I do love you. And you can leave an angry comment in the YouTube, but no, I do wonder if that is not something that's proceeding from a more from a more Protestant experience of Christian community. I don't know. Because I don't move in those circles. But I will say that when I was at art school, there was no Catholic chapel, but God love them, there were some Christians doing like a prayer group, and I went to this a few times, and I was blessed by their hospitality and graciousness. But it was very culturally different for me because it involved a lot of sharing. It involved a lot of like faith sharing,
testimony,
testimony, and then talking about like your struggles, and then of course like that's really kind of opening the space for like input. So there was a lot of like kind of counseling each other and like kind of giving each other your 2 cents that made me kind of uncomfortable.
Right.
And so before long, I kind of stopped going.
Blind leading the blind kind of thing.
Exactly. And so I'm speculating, of course, but I don't wonder if maybe that has something to do with this kind of a picture of this, early Christian community that we're being given, where they're kind of like getting a little into each other's stuff,
Interesting.
The Eden thing to me was a lot more edifying and also a lot more resonant of my experience of Christian life, of sacramental life, and of the ministerial priesthood,
I was really disappointed by the commissioning of the 12, because that's one of my favorite moments in the Gospels. In both Mark and Luke's Gospel, we have that recounted to us. And after the individual calling of 5 of the 12 as disciples, not yet as apostles, we get this scene a bit later where Jesus ascends a mountain. And then in Luke's Gospel, he spends the entire night up praying to the Father on the mountain before he comes down and calls the 12 up to him and names them the 12 apostles there on the mountain, and then tells them he's going to send them forth. We're here in the show, they're just kind of sitting around. He's like, okay, you 12, I'm going to have you do these things. And the impact is on what he's telling them to do, which is great. But the scene in the Gospels is much more epic than what they gave us.
It's funny because there's even like a nod to that. There's even a nod where like, I think Philip is like, was there a ceremony I missed? And Jesus is like, this is it, which is like a weird dialogue to have in there if it like actually was more ceremonial in the Gospel.
Yeah, I mean, in the Gospel, it is, it's following all the moments where God talks to his people from the mountain. And here is Jesus being God on the mountain, calling forth his ambassadors and speaking to them, and giving them this authority. So it's like this almost covenantal moment that we get with the 12. And there it's just like, okay, I have a job for you. Boom, you're done.
Yeah, wow. And you can imagine how they might have shot that differently and like how epic that could have been.
It could have been incredible. Like, can you imagine like a misty mountaintop and Jesus comes down out of the mist and calls them forth? I mean, that could have been like, imagining what that could have looked like gives me chills. I would have loved to have seen it, but I don't know. Maybe that was a budget issue. I have no idea. It's sad they didn't do it.
And I will say, dude, one of my favorite scenes was the very beginning of episode 4, where you get the black and white montage of the apostles going out, and just
that's
like,
a high point. Yeah.
Dude, so awesome.
I love
They're
that.
healing, they're preaching, they're casting out demons, and I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it because
it's black and white. It's mostly silent. You just hear like muted voices when they're preaching. You can't really hear what they're saying.
Yeah. And I loved it because I know that we commemorate the institution of the ministerial priesthood with the washing of the feet, with Holy Thursday, but this sending them out and giving them authority, I mean, that's really the first expression of this priesthood. You know, they're acting in his name. And I was just thinking, like, man, this is where it started. And this was the logic, that Jesus can't be everywhere all at once. So he needs his apostles to go out and be him, to perpetuate his presence to the peoples, you know?
Well, he can be everywhere all at once, but he wants them, as Simon the Zealot
yes.
points out.
I should say that, you know, Jesus is God. He can do everything. But what I mean, of course, is that given the facts of the incarnation and what Jesus wills, you know, that like he's taken on some limitations, and that continues today, right? Okay, so Jesus is everywhere at once. In he's all over the globe in the Eucharist. He's physically present to us, but he wills that his presence be perpetuated through time and through the world and through history, through the church. And that same logic holds today. That very same dynamic that we see playing out at the beginning of that 4th episode is the dynamic of the church today, and of her bishops and of her priests, you know. And I just was like so moved by that.
And I thought there was something of that with the Peter storyline too, and specifically Jesus saying to John, the success of this mission depends on Peter. Now, I still don't know like what specifically that means.
Yeah, I don't know.
But
either.
The idea that like even if Peter isn't like doing well, you can't just leave him behind.
Yeah.
You know, you can't just leave the Pope because he's like not pleasing you. And, you know, and the fact that when Peter steps off that boat, even in his anger and defiance, he has more faith than the other apostles who are like, don't get out of the boat, don't get out of the boat,
right.
You know?
Right. Yeah, and I gotta hand it to them, you know, like the way that they're developing Peter as a character and his relationship to the group, and to Jesus, it's really something, you know. I'm definitely not taking for granted that they're really doing right by this first pope of ours, you know.
But that's that whole opening sequence of season 4. Definitely one of my favorite parts. It's one you can just like rewatch, you know, instantly.
Yeah.
And there's so many beautiful moments without words. I mean, without all the extended dialogue.
Well, and see, this is my point too about like just, you know, exercising more restraint sometimes and not having to like tell us and spell out everything so clearly. But sorry, Brother Josh, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to say precisely that. I think that was one of the things that made that whole montage so wonderful, was that it was wordless. And I think if they took the genius of that scene and applied it to more parts of the show, it would be a stronger show on the whole. In fact, I tried to get my a Protestant friend of mine and I were going on and on about the show at some point with our Jewish friend, and he watched it. And he found that after, I think he watched maybe 3-4 episodes, he just couldn't handle anymore how they kept like explaining all the Jewish rituals every time they did them rather than actually just doing them. There was no room for the subtext to speak. It was always, let's explain, which, as you said, it seems like a good chunk of the audience wants that. But I do think that's a little bit of a... Now, I think, as we've said before, I think this show is vastly superior to a lot of Christian media, but I think that is often a problem with Christian media, perhaps especially Christian media coming out of a Protestant world. And in fact, it reminds me, I might have given this anecdote before, but it reminds me of a friend of mine who grew up very strongly evangelical, and she went to film school with me and said that when she got there, she kept all the scripts that she would write were always torn apart. And one of the things she realized was she didn't know how to write subtext, because none of the Christian literature that she grew up reading, which is pretty much all she read until that point, had any real subtext in it. It was all just, you know, it's on the surface there. So I think this show suffers from that a little bit, and more than I'd like, but it is vastly superior to a lot of the other Christian media that's out there. And for that, I give it a lot of credit.
Yes.
Yeah, there's an interesting like tension there, because, you know, when you look at the stuff that the writers and Dallas Jenkins, the showrunner of the show, list as their inspirations. A lot of it in the TV world is like prestige drama with, whether it's like The Wire or like whatever else. And then you get the impression that not all, but a lot of the audience of this show is probably only watching like NCIS or something. You know what I mean? Like they're probably watching like a lot of network TV where everything's explained, everything's laid out for you. Yeah. And I say that, I don't want to be mean, but I say that because in the sort of like commentary and like the Facebook posts and some of the after show discussion, Dallas Jenkins is often like telling people, don't like be okay with like not understanding a moment until later. You know, like he's like almost teaching them how to watch his show. Part of it is exacerbated by the fact that they have this live chat during like the live streams, the premieres of the episodes on YouTube. And he's like, don't just be asking in the chat, what's happening? Just like watch the show. But it's like, well, okay, but like you put the chat there, so people are going to use it. But it's a fundraising thing, so fine. But yeah, so there is that aspect where I'm sure that they feel they do need to like explain some things, and also like that the length of a TV series. One of the good things about having a long TV series is that you can explain some of these things. You can put in this background, cultural context and stuff, even if it's not always done in the most like adroit, subtle manner.
Yeah.
But the show did get some major like art house cred because Paul Schrader, who was the co-writer of Taxi Driver and some of Scorsese's Raging Bull, also unfortunately The Last Temptation of Christ, he gave this show a glowing review on his Facebook page actually. So that's like the first, it's had a little bit of like mainstream media attention, but that's the first like example I've seen of like sort of like an established like art house name like really giving this show review. He commended the writing, the acting, Jonathan Roumie, and also he said that like the financial model by which the show was made was like an epical like game changer.
Totally.
Which we talked about I think early on. I talked about it in my interview with Jonathan Roumie, which exists, listeners. I did interview Jonathan Roumie after the first season before he just stopped doing interviews. So go and check that out if you want. But yeah, that is something that shouldn't be underrated about this show too, and it'll be interesting to see how that bears fruit in the future.
Yeah, and I just want to like say one more time how much I loved that third episode in Nazareth. I just thought it was so awesome, and how the
tension in that synagogue scene is so palpable.
Oh my gosh, and Jonathan Roumie's sort of confident self-assuredness, and loving rebuke of these people. Yes. It's like, whoa. I loved that we were given this time with them beforehand, playing games and celebrating and sort of, like you start to get the subtle sense that, these people this hometown is not ready to receive him back, And
for the listener, the synagogue scene we're talking about is when Jesus says, I've come to proclaim sight to the blind, liberty to the captive, etc. And today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. That's the synagogue scene we're talking about. But of course, like you said, it is expanded upon. Yeah. It's glossed in a helpful way.
Yes, very much
so.
That
scene, it's so tense.
Yeah.
And the way you're seeing the fact that they made the guy at whose wedding Jesus turned the water into wine is one of the guys who like turns against him and leads him out to the cliff.
Yeah.
It's so great.
And it rings so true too, because we're given these hints ahead of time of how the people who grew up with Jesus are sort of viewing him through an old framework, and they're not ready to or willing to accept that he's announcing himself as something new.
Right.
And it rings so true because I think that all of us have had this experience or have at least seen it where, someone in the family, no matter what sort of growth or maturation or change happens as an adult, he or she is always treated as they were when they were 5 or 10 or 15 years old, and so you see like hints of that before Jesus even gets up and says anything. So it's like, there's going to be some issues. But Jonathan Roumie's sort of presence through all of this that is simultaneously challenging and yet loving is so just like so compelling.
And it's good to see Jesus, some stern moments from Jesus.
Definitely
in this season.
I love that Jonathan Roumie is an imposing physical presence. You know, that he's a tall guy. He's big. He sort of looms over everybody.
The rabbi.
And then
gets in his face a little bit.
No, but I mean, in any scene,
Yeah.
you know, his presence is just, his physical presence is something, but then that's matched by this real there's a real strength in his performance. Oh, I will say there's like a real trust in stillness. This is another thing that I don't see enough of in the performances, that just as the writing is sometimes very telly, the performances are sometimes very showy, very like, you know, you watch, Mary Magdalene's response to Tamar's story or something, and every cut back to her, we have to see her giving some sort of, you know, gesture or facial, you know, twitch or something to like indicate to us that she's having some sort of emotional response, when sometimes all you really need is just a stillness and a listening and a presence. And Jonathan Roumie's performance definitely accomplishes that at times.
Yeah. But I like when he puts a little bit of like, not snark, but a little bit of like just a sharp edge. There's a couple parts in the season, like when he goes to raise Jairus' daughter from the dead, and the mourners are in the house. Like the way that he says she's not dead, she's asleep. It's like there's like a little bit of like a provocation to it.
Sure.
And then also in this synagogue scene in Nazareth, when what does he say? Is it judgment? They're asking about when the judgment or punishment, something like that. One of those two words is coming, and he says something like, "The punishment is in the future." And the way he says it is like, it's coming.
Yeah,
it's coming. It's not like, don't worry. It's like the punishment is in the future.
He never apologizes, right?
Yeah.
That's a really awesome thing. You talked about Mary's apology in the Christmas special. Jesus never apologizes in this show, you know, and he doesn't even hint at an apology for what he's saying, you know, and Jonathan Roumie captures that in the way that he presents everything, every line, every challenge, every rebuke, every exhortation.
Yeah, you can see it in the scene with the where John the Baptist's disciples come to ask the question. As well, when the Pharisee is confronting him, and he's just like, "I said what I said."
Yes,
you know?
but he couples that too with like an incredible warmth and charisma that it's just perfect. It's so many things, and I love too that he has a very distinguished and distinct look without being Hollywood pretty boy. You know, I think that a lot of the male leads that we see in television shows and movies nowadays, they all kind of look the same. They all have this like Hollywood cookie cutter look. Jonathan Roumie doesn't have that, and yet he's still very handsome, very, you know, like distinguished looking. There's something very striking about his look, you know, and so I just think that his having this role is a real godsend, you know, literally providential, as is probably a lot, if not most, of what has gone on to produce this show. It's a small miracle, I think.
Yes.
Maybe not even a small miracle, maybe quite a big miracle, because like I said, you know, there are just these moments that sing, and the last thing I'll say about that episode, that third episode, is we get this incredibly moving sort of premonition of the passion in their taking him out to go cast him, you know, headlong from the cliffside, and Mary's response in that moment, and the look between Jesus and Mary before he's taken out. You know, I felt a lot of assurance for when that chapter is inevitably covered in this series. Right. I don't know how they'll do it.
There was also a prefiguration of the raising of Lazarus, I thought, because they go out to the tomb of Saint Joseph
Yeah.
and they're standing together.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
I couldn't help but think.
Yeah.
of
Sure,
Amazing
sure,
Lazarus,
totally.
you know?
I thought of the same.
But yeah, like I think that's that. Obviously they'll cross that bridge when they get there. I'm sure they're already thinking about it, how they're gonna do, or if they're gonna do, or what they're gonna do when it comes time for the Passion. But judging from what was shown in that third episode, I feel very confident. I'm very confident in them,
Yeah.
and in these actors that they've cast, and yeah, I'm just definitely looking forward to the next season. I definitely recommend this season to anybody who's not seen it. With of course the caveat that there's like some moments that are better than others, but those moments that are better, those are like unmissable moments in Christian cinema. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My other favorite moment in the season, besides the montage of the disciples going out and healing and preaching and casting out demons, is the scene right after Jesus tells them he's going to send them. And this is the scene. This is one of the most. It's great because it's a totally original scene, writing wise, and it's one of the most moving scenes in the season. Is Jesus and little James. When little James asks Jesus,
yeah.
how am I going to go heal people when
Yeah.
I myself am crippled? Because I forget what condition the actor has, but that's a really moving scene. And of course, it's very Catholic in its view of suffering. And it fits in with the theme of the Peter subplot too, because it's this theme of like, why does God allow his faithful to suffer? And it's just done beautifully, how Jesus explains like the impact that he's going to have, how he could heal him and he will if he wants, but he's going to be impacting more people and teaching them about how to find joy and accept suffering if he's healing people himself without having been healed himself. And it's just such a great scene.
And that it ends with him, saying, you will be healed.
Yeah.
Like that's...
And I'm sure that this is one of those things we've talked about, very Protestant things in the show. This is one of those aspects where Dallas Jenkins pushes back against not Protestantism per se, but certain popular notions in Protestantism, subcultures in Protestantism, like you might say the prosperity gospel or things like that. And I'm sure that there are viewers of the show who are like, no, I want little James to be healed, And so that Dallas Jenkins, pushes back against that, and also did so with the scene where Mary Magdalene in season 2 sort of goes back to her old ways momentarily, which I know upset a lot of people as well, because once saved always saved kind of thing. So that's an area where he does challenge his audience to go a little bit deeper spiritually in a way that I think is very Catholic. So I really appreciated that, and also sets up my favorite little moment of that montage, which is after we actually see little James heal people, and we just see this moment between him and Big James, and the look of like tenderness and like love and like affirmation that Big James gives to little James in that moment, like just knowing what's going on in his heart, as I thought was very moving.
There's an awesome little Easter egg too in that scene where little James says something to the effect, I can't remember what the line is, but he says something about not speaking or like not being quick to talk. And it's like, that's like a reference to the letter of St. James, because I that was what I picked up, because in the letter of St. James he comes down pretty hard about like the tongue being this like
I totally missed that. That's pretty cool.
That's
pretty cool.
One thing that I hope for the show, because I think that it does a very good job of showing these apostles and their sort of their level 1 form, where they still have all these imperfections and all this dysfunction. I am hoping that we do see more heroic virtue from these characters, because at the end of the day, they are saints. Mary Magdalene, Saint James, Saint Peter. so I'm looking forward to when I'm hoping that there will be like a sense of how these characters, how these real historic figures, these literal saints, excelled in heroic virtue by the end, you know?
Yeah, you know, I do have like a worry about John the Evangelist. We already talked about John the Baptist and how disappointing that the show's portrayal of him has largely been. Not too bad in this season, you know.
Well, but that's because we're not really seeing him in this season.
This was the first time I liked him in this season.
Right. John the Evangelist, there hasn't been much special about him yet. Like, we're told, he keeps mentioning, oh, Jesus called me beloved once, you know, whatever. Like, we're never given a sense of what that means. Like, we're never given a sense that he is somehow like, now maybe he'll become this. You get the sense in the scripture that he is the one who's like almost most like pure of heart by the time of the crucifixion, you know? Now, of course, there is the Sons of Thunder thing. There is the, you know, there are indications of like, I guess, ego with James and John earlier in the gospel. But I don't know what they're going to do. It's not that he's a bad or annoying character by any means. It's just that I'm not seeing much that sets him apart.
And he is set apart, you know. He's the beloved, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he's the only one next to Mary at the crucifixion.
Right now, all we get is verbal references to that.
Yeah,
which always seem to dismiss it in one way or another.
Yeah,
you know. We already talked about that a bit, so we don't need to go into it too much. But I'm waiting to see something that will hint in the direction that he really goes. I did want to ask about that John the Baptist scene, not the one where he's present, but when he sends his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for someone else?" The show takes that as something of a provocative question, like not so much that John is doubting it, but that he is, Jesus says, impatient. He's in prison. He wants to be freed so he can continue his ministry. And this is consistent with the characterization, that we've seen of John the Baptist in previous seasons.
In terms of whether he might have been questioning his initial identification of Jesus, that I think there's a little wiggle room in terms of how you interpret what's happening in the gospel at that point, because Jesus is prophetically fulfilling a lot of different things, right? He's taking on, which in the Jewish mind to that point were not a unified portrait, right? So he's the Messiah, but he's also the suffering servant, but he's also the great prophet that would arise, that would be like Moses. So he's kind of fulfilling a lot of different things which were not necessarily in their minds already connected, right? So a lot of people through a good chunk of his ministry hail him as a prophet, or perhaps the prophet, the great prophet that would arise like Moses that they were expecting. But they don't expect that to also necessarily be the Messiah and or the suffering servant. Those are not connected, and I think that's in a providential intentionality there, because this is how the plan of salvation was kept mysterious from even the rebellious angelic powers, was that it wasn't all spelled out so neatly. So I think there's room for John to be confused without being, let's say, sinful in that confusion. He's not sure if Jesus is going to be the one that might liberate him from prison, which is probably something he's expecting, or what exactly is happening.
Yeah, because I mean, should we wait for someone else? There is a little bit of a provocation to that. If you take it as he doesn't really doubt, but it's like, well, come on, let's get the show on the road, which is very consistent with what we've seen of his character. Mm-hmm. It's interesting too. Peter is shown to already believe that Jesus is God. I don't know if you caught that, because he says he's the first and the last. I think it's when he's talking to John and they're on the road.
That's right.
And he's saying, yes, I believe in Jesus. I believe in him, and he can do anything, and he's the first and the last. So that was, I don't know if that's if they're jumping the gun there, or if we're already there with Peter.
You're right. I noticed that when he said it and then I forgot about it. I think that is jumping the gun a little bit. I think it's very easy for us now to equate Messiah with divinity. that wouldn't have been such a clear. I mean, I guess I should nuance that a little bit. They had the idea of divinity was a little bit more flexible at that point, but they didn't expect the Messiah to be God incarnate. So for Peter to just kind of casually throw that out there is a little weird at that point. But I mean, perhaps not entirely. Well, it's weird also because we haven't even gotten to the scene at Caesarea Philippi where he confesses him to be the Christ, right? And that's like this big thing in Matthew's gospel. Yeah. Well, in the synoptics generally, but it's so it would be strange for that to be climactic if he's already telling everyone, well, he's God already, so why doesn't he? It removes any sense of buildup. Now, in John's gospel, you get some of them saying that he's the Messiah right away. I think Nathaniel maybe says that pretty quickly in like the first couple chapters, but it's not really. It doesn't take on the character of this public declaration in front of the group.
Yeah. So in previous episode, we complained a little bit about like some of the Pharisee side plots as being a little bit dry, like getting into the backstory of the different groups of Pharisees and the political maneuverings and stuff. I actually thought that the Pharisee stuff in this season was quite a bit more interesting.
I agree. Thought that was very well done.
In part because it was hooked into more actual biblical incidents, and particularly the raising of Jairus' daughter. But the stuff with Jairus and Rabbi Yusuf and even the Shmuel stuff I thought was pretty interesting and also very unexpected, where Shmuel encounters Jesus after the feeding of the 5,000 and asks to go, he asks to talk to him basically, and Jesus invites him to go pray with him alone. And so that was quite unexpected, that Shmuel, who's the one who sort of gotten this ball rolling of the eventual persecution of Jesus, is maybe actually going to convert, prior to that. We don't know, but he's clearly perplexed and is lacking the initial sort of like brash self-confidence that he had initially.
And so I thought how they handled Jairus was similarly interesting, because when they introduce him, you feel like he's, at least for part of his screen time, going to be something of an antagonist, because he talks about how he brings order to places and all of this. And it obviously makes Yusuf nervous. And so it sounds like he's maybe going to be part of this persecution effort, but it rather quickly becomes completely the opposite. I thought the whole Jairus buildup was really good. Unfortunately, I felt like the actual raising of his daughter, which is juxtaposed with the healing of Veronica. I thought the healing of Veronica was incredibly powerful. I loved that scene, and I loved her character. Definitely. That was one of my favorite standout scenes in the show. But
for the listener, the Veronica is the woman with the hemorrhage, who is the issue of blood for 12 years, and she's healed by Jesus by touching the fringe of his garment.
Right.
Yeah.
But ostensibly she may end up being the Veronica who
that was interesting choice of name. Yeah.
But, well, there's a history behind that. But just to finish the other point quickly,
really?
Jairus is. I felt like the actual moment when Jairus' daughter is raised should have been much more powerful than it was. I didn't feel like it had the emotional resonance of even the healing of Veronica, but certainly of a lot of the other healings that we get in the show. It was fine, but it's the first resurrection miracle that we get, and it didn't really have that punch. It happens very quickly.
It's a good point. It's a good point.
And they don't really bring you as strongly into the character's emotions as they managed to do in other scenes.
We just right to Jesus telling them not to tell anybody about it, like right after the healing.
Yeah.
We just watched a film that featured a resurrection from the dead, and that was done very well. So if you think about sort of just how differently those two moments land. Now, granted, in Ordet, you have a whole film leading up to this climactic ending, but here, still, you're right. There's definitely something like kind of missing in the sheer weight of what it is to bring someone back from the dead.
Just to answer your thing about Veronica, that actually there's an old tradition that woman's name was Veronica. That was particularly picked up in the Eastern churches. And it goes back at least to this apocryphal 4th or 5th century Acts of Pilate, or also known as the Gospel of Nicodemus, where it identifies the woman with the hemorrhage of blood as Veronica. In the West, where people tried to identify who that was, they often identified her with Martha of Bethany. But I will say that
Veronica in the East identified with Veronica of the Veil?
No. That's a completely distinct tradition, because the Veronica of the Veil actually comes from the name of the veil being the Veronica, or the Vera icon, the true image. And then eventually the name of the veil gets attached to the woman that had the veil.
Right.
So it arises completely separate from this other tradition. And in fact, if you
Which,
go
by
to
the way,
Yeah.
way, for listeners, like, there's no reason for that to mean that she wasn't a real person.
Right. No, she
Like, the
obviously
idea
someone
that
did it.
Her name
but
means true icon, like, because nobody remembered her name or something, and we had the veil, and
Yeah.
there's no
Yeah.
reason for that to make us doubt the story.
No,
Anyway.
sure. Yeah. The name is ascribed to a woman very late, but that doesn't mean that the woman wasn't real. We can symbolically attribute the name to her. That doesn't mean that she didn't have some other name and wasn't a real person.
Right. We should probably start wrapping up, but I want to bring up one more gripe that I've sort of like,
A farewell gripe.
farewell gripe. Yes. I'm glad that we're being a little more frank in some of our criticisms of the aesthetics of the show, because I think we've been watching it long enough to sort of be a little more confident in it, and I think it just makes the discussion fresher and allows us to look at some of the big picture issues of how the story is approached. The use of language. Okay, so this is a show that like self-consciously takes seriously its like period nature with the different Jewish ceremonials and the different factions of the Pharisees and the Hellenistic Jews and stuff. Okay, but it's also a show that like makes a point of using very contemporary language and having very contemporary emotional responses to things. Yeah. I'm not okay. So I'm not saying that's on the whole a bad thing. But I think the show is quite insensitive to like the way that anachronistic language and expressions betrays anachronistic like thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
If that makes sense. Like
Totally.
the net effect is to like there is a way to like get us into a foreign mindset that is still universally human.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recently read this novel called The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck, which is a novel about Chinese peasants, and the syntax that she uses is unusual. The way they talk is unusual. It's of course in English, but it still seems strange, and there's a strangeness to it, and yet you still relate to the characters.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very different way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Here, it feels a little less like that. That's okay in general, but I think that you have to be attentive to like certain things that stick out particularly like a sore thumb, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, and especially when it becomes like a self-referential, modern media saturated way of talking, that like sort of takes us out of the illusion.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's things that are ambiguous, like clapping, applause. I don't know if clapping was a thing back then.
Sure.
May well be. Doesn't bother me that much. There's also like
But there is something odd about like the Sermon on the Mount is over and now it's like, okay, then thank you, little James and John, you know, your work, we couldn't have done it without you. Everybody give a little clap, you know, like it feels like the end of
and Joanna
any
asking,
number of like
Joanna asking if they didn't take up a collection and saying she wants to help with the ministry, like all of that felt very like
yes.
Right.
We're in a modern megachurch setting, plus the staging and the
totally.
There's a scene where two characters give like a secret handshake and fist bump.
How often does the word ministry occur in the Gospels?
Oh, in the Chosen a lot.
Yeah, in the Chosen a lot, and that was something that I definitely was like
The
picking up
angels
on.
ministered to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I don't know, you know.
Right.
I don't know if we would. I don't want to assert this with too much confidence. I don't think we get the word ministry in the Gospels.
Right. But there's like, they're often talking about the ministry, you know, and Jesus is the way, you know, like there definitely is something like anachronistic about that. Sorry, but I'm as you're talking, I'm
Ministry
like thinking
feels like a subset.
totally.
of
But I'm just saying
things.
that all this
Yes.
stuff is like popping up. I don't
No,
want
no,
to
no.
cut you off. Continue,
Sure.
please. But
Sure. Okay. Peter comes home from
oh no, I know what you're gonna do.
from his,
I know what you're talking about.
from his trip, his big old trip. He comes home to his wife. He wants to get some action. I'm sorry, listeners. He's been missing his wife. They're back, and he is talking to her about something about studying. Something I forget how it even comes up, but it's very 1980s movie.
I know.
Oh, we're gonna get some studying done. All right.
I
That's
know,
not the exact
it's-
line, but that's basically the
Yeah.
vibe.
Yeah.
Okay, same scene. Maybe not the same scene. Same scene.
Same
basically.
episode.
Yeah. I've been thinking about our family, starting a family. It's time.
Ah.
Were
Yeah.
they using contraception? I don't think that the show
No.
is seriously telling us that they're using contraception, but what else does that mean?
I know.
Are they using
Yeah.
NFP?
And
No.
they wouldn't have known about
That was-
cycles in that way, you know, like there wouldn't have been NFP. And so,
Yeah.
so this whole notion of like, it's time, as if there would have been like a conceptual sort of like distinction between marriage
Conceptual
and
distinction.
yeah, like, you know,
Pun.
like
Pun.
Oh, right. Ah, no pun intended.
Pun intended.
But yeah, no, dude, I was definitely squirming at that.
Okay.
I was too.
Jesus says something in the Decapolis about, I'm here for everybody, regardless of race or creed. Okay.
Oof.
That's a very modern,
Yeah.
political speech cliche.
Mhm.
I saved this for the end of the episode because I didn't want to start it out and make people think that the show was just like this, hacky, because it's not like all the time. Okay. Gift used as a verb. That's all. It doesn't really say anything like
Martha Stewart came up with that.
culturally. Really? Okay. So it's just weird. It just takes you. That's one of the things where it's not like it doesn't indicate a foreign way of thinking so much, a modern way of thinking so much as just like it takes you out of the illusion because it's a distinctly modern way of speaking. Okay.
Wait, can I give a quick 2-second rant about the
Sure.
Peter Eden thing?
Yeah.
We know from the Gospels that Simon Peter lived with his brother Andrew, and that Jesus also lived with them. So this like empty house privacy thing that they established in the show repeatedly, as if like this is a nuclear family and you have to fill the house, that doesn't happen. You have extended relatives living together, crammed all together, sleeping in the same room. There would have not been much of any privacy ever. So that whole thing was a huge anachronism, and also
Gotcha.
just contrary to what the gospel establishes, which is that Simon lived with Andrew and Jesus comes to live with him in Capernaum pretty quickly.
It's also contrary to like, if I can just make a quick side thing. They dodged a bullet with the brothers of Christ, obviously, in this season. Dallas Jenkins said it was never something he wanted to seriously address in the show. Who were these brothers of Jesus?
Yeah.
And so there's only one reference to it just to get it out of the way. They're not even called his brothers in the episode, but it's when he's in Nazareth and goes to see his mother, and he says, "Where are," I forget what names he gives them, but
Simon and Jude, maybe,
or Simon and Jude, and she refers to them as the boys. So it's ambiguous. Are these cousins? Are these brothers from a previous marriage of St. Joseph? Whatever. I'm grateful that they didn't go into it any more than that. They're not there for the holiday. The expectation is they would be part of the household or something, seemingly. But then she says they went to celebrate somewhere else. So there's some recognition of that. But anyway. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciated how they tried to dodge the bullet there. However, because they kind of set up the expectation that people live in nuclear family units, it almost doesn't work because they're almost, So I like that they tried, but because of what they were doing elsewhere, it didn't work as well as it should have. I'll leave it at that.
General quipping, just too many quips at serious moments, too many jokes. We already talked about that. Here's the example I want to give, though. On the boat, in the storm, Peter's walking on the water. Who is it? Thomas? I think it's Thomas.
It's
says,
Thomas.
"How is this the second most incredible thing I've seen today?"
Yeah.
Okay, no.
Yeah.
Just experience the moment. That I really think, I could be wrong, I really think that is such a modern
Yes.
way of like, it's like thinking in listicles. You know,
Yeah.
like top 10 most incredible things I saw, you know,
Yeah.
with Jesus on the day of the Decapolis. The most incredible was the feeding of the 5,000. And the second most incredible, he's like mentally making his Facebook post as it's happening.
Yeah.
You know, so that
But I
also
mean, you know, there's
stood out
also
to
it's
me.
also just like it feels a little fan servicey. It feels a little like
Well, that's what these self-referential jokes are
Yes,
in the Marvel
it-
movies and stuff. It's fan
exactly,
service.
and a lot of times these things, you know, they made me think of like the prequel trilogies of Star Wars or something, or how this is unrelated, but like how your world is shrunk down, where when every character becomes like a central character to the storyline, like where you know the guy working at the synagogue like happens to be Jairus, whose daughter is going to get raised, you know, or like you get this sense of like a collapsed world and everything being quite small when like C-3PO is just turning up everywhere, you know. So that's unrelated, perhaps, but
Wait, I'm sorry. Which one in The Chosen is the equivalent of C-3PO?
in this case it's Jairus. Okay, Jairus is C-3PO.
Wait, I'm sorry. Which one in The Chosen is C-3PO? I'm confused.
Is
Sorry, I
this-
was trying to do a Matthew voice. But okay.
We really need to wrap this show
one more
up,
gripe.
boys.
One more gripe. I'm not gonna, okay, Pilate and his wife. I'm
Yeah.
not going to pick on the actors. Why is Pilate having guys crucified like right outside of his like scene, like in his scenic view from his nice house? Like that makes no sense. They would have been like on the outskirts of town or something.
Yeah.
It would have been, or in the middle
Yeah.
of the road where people were coming in or something. As
It's
a
like
warning.
you're inside your house and you can hear their pained screams outside.
Yeah.
Why would that happen?
No, it
Pilate
would not
never
have
do
happened.
that.
No, they were
Yeah.
purposely crucified just outside the town by the city gate so that everyone would have to see them when they're coming in. But
Yes,
they're
but not so that
defiling the city.
Pilate's wife's day would be ruined
Yeah.
by like hearing the screams of the dying and looking at them from her balcony. What is that? That's
Well, no.
ridiculous.
Well, I mean, it's worth remembering too. In paganism as well as in Judaism, dead bodies defile you. You don't want them near you. The cemeteries were always outside the city. That goes away with Christianity. Christianity is what brings like relics into the churches and the people out into the graveyards. But that would have been abhorrent to pagans and Jews. So you would not have had crucified people like, you know, right outside your balcony, edifying you with their screams. It's very strange. I really didn't understand why Pilate's wife had like a androgynous haircut. That confused me. And she seemed a good deal younger than him too. So like the way they costumed her.
they're both
was-
pretty. I mean, they're both pretty young.
They're both young.
I was
but
surprised by how young this Pilate was.
The
Yeah.
other thing that bothered me, and just to get even more petty, is when Pilate meets with the Secret Service Roman guy who I still don't know what his deal is going to be, but I can't remember his name, but he's a likable character. Anyway, he said, Pilate's like, I've been reading Miles Gloriosus by Plautus. And I'm like, no, it's not Miles Gloriosus. You still, like, if you're going to use Latin words, you still have to pronounce them like Latin in the show.
No,
you
man,
know?
Miles Gloriosus. You know, he's
Miles the Glorious.
the swingingest.
Swingingest cat in the land. Wow. So anyway, just to pop off,
Yeah,
cap off.
totally.
Okay, so how are we going to wrap this up?
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah.
You know, thanks if you made it this far, then you definitely got to give us a like, hit a subscribe, you know. Maybe if you're feeling really enthusiastic, you can head on over to catholicculture.org. They produce this podcast. We produce this podcast. We are catholicculture.org.
Yeah.
If you want to support the podcast or any of our other shows, there's a whole 4 of them. You can go to catholicculture.org/donate.
/audio. Anyway, thanks, Brother Josh, for joining us yet again to discuss The Chosen. We appreciate your presence on these episodes.
My pleasure. It's been a delight.
All right, everybody. See you later. I mispronounced later.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic works through professional, high-quality audiobook recordings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, exploring Catholic arts and culture with a variety of notable guests. You'll find all of this at CatholicCulture.org.